Today's lesson is going to be on evaluating functions. So we're going to practice using function notations to evaluate. First off, let's review what the word evaluate typically means in the past before we had functions. We've already done this before. Evaluate is when you're given an expression and it might have several variables in it, such as that. But then they tell you to evaluate for a certain value. So they might give you an answer or a value for x and y. So evaluate for x equals -2 and y equals 3. And what that means is you assume that x equals -2 and y equals 3, and you solve this expression using those numbers instead of x and y. So you actually plug in those values for your x and y. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this expression using the numbers I'm given. So we do 3 times x squared is -2 squared. Whenever you put a negative number in for a variable, it's a good idea to put it in parentheses like that. Plus 2 times y, so that's 2 times 3. Either use a multiplication symbol or use parentheses, or both if it makes you more comfortable to do that. And then you solve using order of operations. That's all there is to it. We've been evaluating expressions for a while now. So we do order of operations. That means we have to do exponents first. So I'll have 3 times -2 times itself is 4, plus 2 times 3. And then I have to do multiplication before I add. So I can multiply these two together, and I can multiply these two together. And then I add. So my answer here is 18 when I evaluate that expression. So functions are very similar. It's just a different notation. Since functions tend to use f of x instead of a variable like y, it's going to have a different notation. So in these kinds of equations, what you're going to see is something like f of x. That's a function. Remember, that just is another way of writing y. So f of x equals, and they might say something like 3x squared plus x minus 1. And then they'll say to evaluate, and instead of telling you x equals 2, they'll write it this way. This right here means replace the x with a -2. So when whatever you see inside parentheses, since what they're doing here is they're essentially replacing the x with a -2, they're telling you that x is equivalent to -2. So you're going to do the same in the other side of the equation on that expression that has x's. There'll only be one variable in these for the time being, so you don't have to worry about more than that. So that's just the way they write that x equals -2. So you'll actually rewrite this expression the same way we did the last problem. Replace every x that you see with a -2 and rewrite the whole thing. Don't start solving right away. Just write it with a -2 in place of x. Use parentheses, especially when the number is negative. And then you start solving using order of operations. So I have to do exponents first. -2 squared is +4. And then I have to multiply before I add or subtract. So 12 for 3 times 4. And then the last part, since all I have is addition and subtraction has to be done from left to right. So we do 12 plus -2, which is 10. 10 minus 1 is 9. So that's how you evaluate with a function. It's the exact same thing you've been doing in terms of just plugging in a number for x. It just looks different because we're using this function notation instead of just telling you x equals whatever. So let's practice another one. It'll always start off with a general f of x equals, and they'll tell you what that function is equal to. So let's say it's that 8 minus 3x plus x to the third. And we are going to evaluate f of -1. So what that means is x equals -1, so we're going to take our expression and we're going to replace every x that we see with a -1. I'm going to do 8 minus 3 times -1 plus -1 to the third power. And we solve using order of operations. So negative 1 to the third power, that's where I start. Negative 1, if you're not sure about this, actually do negative 1 times itself 3 times. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. And then positive 1 times another negative 1 gives me negative 1. So I have now 8 minus 3 times negative 1 plus negative 1. Or you could just write minus negative 1. Then I have to do multiplication before any adding or subtracting, so that's where I go next. It's a good idea to underline the step that you're doing at that moment. So we have this minus sign. We don't leave it off. That's still a minus sign. And then we do 3 times negative 1, which gives me a negative 3. So I have 8 minus negative 3 plus negative 1. Now I do subtraction and addition from left to right. So I do 8 minus negative 3 first. Don't forget, keep change, change. When you're subtracting integers, you're really adding the opposite. So you keep the first one the same, change subtraction to addition, change the negative to a plus. So it's subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive. So all I have to do here is 8 plus 3, which is 11. And I still have plus negative 1 or minus 1. 11 plus negative 1 is 10. So, and usually you just kind of bring this down as part of your answer to confirm, yes, f of negative 1, meaning when I plug in negative 1 for x, equals 10. My answer is 10. So that's all there is to evaluating functions. It's something you've been doing for a while now. It just takes on a different form.